Before she became a name in a tragic headline, Michelle Warner was a woman with plans, fire, and fight. She was someone you didn't just meet. You remembered her. Friends described her as vibrant and determined, with an infectious laugh and a presence that filled the room. She wasn't loud, but she was powerful in her own right. Michelle was the kind of person who carried more than her share of weight on her shoulders and still managed to smile. Growing up in Odessa, Texas, she knew hardship. She also knew how to rise above it. She was a devoted mother to her young daughter from a previous relationship and was actively pursuing a nursing degree, a field that matched her nurturing heart and practical nature. Michelle wanted to build something stable, something lasting, for herself and her children. She had no time for games, no tolerance for failure, and no interest in pretending. She was, in every sense of the word, a woman on a mission. Then she met Mark Castellano. On the surface, Mark appeared to be someone who fit the life Michelle was trying to build. He was intelligent, articulate, and outwardly thoughtful, the kind of man who knew how to say the right things at the right time. There was a quiet intensity about him, a kind of vulnerability disguised as depth. He could talk for hours about books, ideas, technology, anything that made him seem like more than just a man from a small Texas town. For Michelle, who had been so focused on survival and sacrifice, Mark seemed like an oasis. Someone who could see her, someone who spoke her language, and someone who she hoped might stand beside her in the kind of future she had long imagined. But Michelle didn't know, not yet, that Mark's charm was a mask. That behind the controlled tone and soft words was something much more troubling. Early into the relationship, cracks began to show, though they were subtle at first. Mark was moody, prone to long silences or emotional outbursts that didn't always match the situation. He'd become defensive over small disagreements. He had a way of twisting conversations, making Michelle feel like the one who was overreacting. If she questioned him, he'd turn it back on her. "Why are you always trying to make me feel bad?" he'd say, or, "I thought you were different." It wasn't overt abuse, not yet, but it was something more insidious. Manipulation, seeded with guilt. Gaslighting, before she even had a name for it. Michelle tried to explain away the inconsistencies. She was empathetic to a fault, always looking for the root of a person's pain, always believing that love could help someone grow. She figured Mark just needed stability, needed to feel supported, needed someone to believe in him. And she did. But as the months passed, the relationship began to take a toll. Friends started to notice that Michelle wasn't herself. She seemed more withdrawn, more cautious with her words, less free with her laughter. And when they asked about Mark, she often brushed it off with a soft smile and vague assurances. "We're just figuring things out," she'd say. Every couple has ups and downs. The real tipping point came when Michelle discovered she was pregnant. It was the kind of news that could have solidified a bond, or cracked it wide open. For Michelle, it was both. She knew what it meant to raise a child alone. She'd done it before. But she also wanted this child to have a father, to grow up in a complete home. And she wanted, desperately, to believe that Mark could step up, that he would grow into the role, that things would be different now. She gave him chance after chance, despite the signs that said otherwise, his inconsistency, his controlling nature, his thinly veiled jealousy, even toward her daughter. As the pregnancy progressed, so did the emotional warfare. Mark grew more volatile, more distant. One day he was doting and apologetic, the next, cold and accusatory. He began isolating Michelle even further, questioning her phone calls, undermining her relationships with friends and family, and constantly shifting the narrative of every argument. He was always the victim, the misunderstood partner, the one trying his best. Michelle, by contrast, was made to feel like the problem, like she was never supportive enough, never trusting enough, never good enough. Eventually, she made the difficult decision to move to Houston. The hope was to start fresh, build a life where she could work, raise her children, and maybe, just maybe, salvage what was left of their relationship. But Houston didn't bring peace. If anything, it intensified the toxicity. Mark followed her there, and though they never quite lived as a happy couple, their lives remained deeply entangled. He oscillated between being present and distant, nurturing and cruel. And Michelle, trapped in a cycle of emotional confusion, tried again and again to make things work, not for herself anymore, but for her son. Because that was who she was. A woman who believed in doing right by her children. A woman who wanted to give her son a father, even if that meant swallowing her own pain. A woman who thought she could fix something broken because she'd done hard things before and survived. But what Michelle didn't fully understand, or maybe didn't want to, was that Mark wasn't just broken. He was dangerous. The years of psychological warfare had worn her down. Her light, once fierce and unshakable, had begun to flicker under the weight of constant emotional erosion. And Mark, whose control over her only seemed to grow stronger, wasn't interested in healing or compromise. He was interested in dominance, in control, in never being left behind. And somewhere in that darkness, something turned from toxic to lethal. 2. The breaking point. Tensions before the disappearance. By the summer of 2012, the situation inside the small Houston apartment shared by Michelle Warner and Mark Castellano had become unbearable. Though they were no longer a couple in any real sense, they continued to live together. A decision born not from affection, but necessity. Finances were tight, and with a young son between them, the practical solution had been to share space. But the arrangement was far from practical. What it became, instead, was a slow brewing storm of resentment, passive aggression, and looming dread, one that Michelle could feel closing in on her more and more each day. Michelle had begun to reclaim herself. That was part of the problem. After years of being emotionally undermined, she had started to push back. She was working, focusing on her nursing studies again, and building a support network of friends and family who reminded her of her strength. Her laughter had started to return. Her energy, though dimmed by stress, was flickering back to life. She'd speak openly to friends about her plans, to finish school, to find her own place, to give her kids the kind of home they deserved, free from volatility and fear. But her newfound independence didn't sit well with Mark. Control had always been his language. When Michelle leaned on him, when she was emotionally exhausted or overwhelmed, he felt empowered. But as she found her footing, Mark unraveled. He became moodier, more suspicious, more controlling in subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, ways. He began interrogating her about her whereabouts. He accused her of being selfish, of trying to ruin the family. The fact that they were no longer romantically involved didn't matter to him. In his mind, Michelle was still his. The idea that she might truly leave, not just emotionally, but physically, with their son, triggered something deeper in Mark. Something possessive. Something dangerous. Inside the apartment, it was like walking on glass. Michelle kept things calm for the sake of their son, but the air was heavy with tension. Conversations were clipped. Mark's anger simmered just beneath the surface. There were whispered arguments after the child went to bed, slammed doors, long silences that spoke volumes. Friends who visited the home later described it as thick with unease. Even their young son, though unable to articulate it, seemed more anxious during those final weeks, clinging more to Michelle, becoming upset more easily, sensing the emotional imbalance that hung around them like a storm cloud. Michelle confided in a few close friends about how bad things had gotten. She told one friend that Mark was becoming unhinged, that he watched her every move, that she no longer felt safe in her own home. She began sleeping with the door locked. She had started making arrangements to leave, slowly, carefully, so as not to set him off. She was saving money, looking for a new place, considering custody arrangements. But she was also scared. Mark wasn't the kind of man who let go easily. His paranoia had deepened. He spoke of Michelle trying to turn their son against him, accused her of wanting to cut him out. He'd swing between pleading and threatening, between playing the victim and lashing out. In the days leading up to Michelle's disappearance, these behaviors intensified. On the surface, Mark still maintained the guise of composure, especially in front of family. But behind closed doors, his anxiety turned to obsession. He scoured her texts. He monitored her social media. He even began to imply that if Michelle tried to leave, she would regret it. These weren't idle threats, though he never stated them outright. But the implications were chilling. Michelle knew him well enough to understand what he was capable of, emotionally, mentally. But whether she truly believed he would cross a line into violence is something no one will ever know for sure. Her family sensed something was wrong. Michelle had always been communicative, especially with her mother and sister. But in the final week, her calls became more tense. Her tone was strained. She mentioned wanting out, fast. But she didn't want to create drama. She didn't want to uproot her son again. That was always her conflict. The mother's instinct to protect her child from chaos versus the woman's instinct to escape it herself. Her sister later said that Michelle felt trapped, emotionally and financially. She was trying to do everything the right way, the sister said. She didn't want to blow things up. She just wanted peace. And yet, there was no peace left in that apartment. The pressure was rising by the hour. Mark could feel her slipping away, and Michelle could feel him tightening his grip. Every decision, every step toward freedom, came with the risk of provoking him. But staying, she knew, was no longer an option. Something had to give. Then came the weekend of September 22nd, 2012. To outsiders, it was just another Saturday. Michelle was home with her son. Mark was in the apartment. There had been no reports of screaming, no calls to police, no public explosion. But inside, something snapped. Whatever had been building for weeks, months, even years, finally reached its tragic crescendo. That night, Michelle vanished. Her family would later describe the silence as deafening. No texts, no calls, no updates, not even a goodbye. It was unlike her, entirely unlike her, to go silent. Especially without telling someone she trusted. Especially without checking on her children. Especially without giving any indication that she was leaving on her own. That's when the alarms began to sound. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, Mark began to tell his story. But it wouldn't take long for the cracks in that story to start showing. 3. The disappearance. Lies, deflection, and delay. Michelle Warner's sudden disappearance didn't begin with a bang. It began with a silence. A silence that, for those who knew her best, was deafening. It started on a Saturday night in late September 2012. To outsiders, it may have looked like a typical evening. But behind the doors of the modest apartment Michelle shared with Mark Castellano, something irrevocable had shifted. And by the time Sunday morning dawned, Michelle was gone, not just out of sight, but out of contact, out of reach, and, ominously, out of character. For Michelle's family, the first red flag wasn't dramatic. It was the absence of a simple phone call. Michelle, by all accounts, was deeply connected to her loved ones. She spoke to her mother every day, often multiple times. She kept in close contact with her siblings. And above all, she was a devoted mother. Even on the most chaotic of days, she always managed to check in. But that Sunday, her phone was silent. No texts. No updates. No cheerful check-ins. The alarm didn't go off all at once. It started as a whisper of unease. Maybe she was just busy. Maybe her phone had died. But as the hours ticked by, that whisper became a scream. Mark, meanwhile, told a very different story. When asked where Michelle had gone, he shrugged it off. According to him, Michelle had simply walked out. He claimed they had a fight. Nothing unusual. Nothing heated, just the usual back and forth that had defined their strained cohabitation. He said she grabbed a bag, walked out the door, and left him alone with their son. Just like that. No note. No word to her family. No goodbye. It was a story that, on the surface, might have been plausible to a stranger. But to those who actually knew Michelle, it was laughable. More than laughable, it was infuriating. Her family immediately knew something was wrong. Michelle would never have abandoned her children, not under any circumstance. And certainly not without a plan, a phone call, or some kind of explanation. This was a woman who lived for her kids. She was careful, thoughtful, and deeply maternal. Even during her worst arguments with Mark, she never stormed off or made rash decisions. The idea that she'd simply vanish into the night, willingly, was preposterous. And the fact that Mark seemed so relaxed, so detached, only intensified their concern. From the beginning, Mark's demeanor was off. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't even curious. When Michelle's mother called to ask where she was, he gave a cold, almost robotic reply. She left. No worry. No urgency. No effort to find her. Just a vague, dismissive narrative and a clear refusal to help. It was as if he expected everyone to accept it and move on. But Michelle's family refused. They knew better. And the more Mark talked, the less sense his story made. The inconsistencies were glaring. First, he said she left after a fight. Then, he claimed she'd left to get space. In another version, she was supposedly heading to a friend's house, though he didn't know which friend. When police began asking questions, his narrative shifted again. He seemed annoyed by the attention, irritated by the concern, and completely unfazed by Michelle's absence. He never joined search efforts. He didn't post on social media. He didn't plead for her return. Instead, he stayed quiet, calculating, watching, as the people who loved Michelle scrambled to find her. When Michelle's family reported her missing, the 911 call carried a tone of restrained panic. On the line was someone trying to stay calm, trying to convince the dispatcher that something was wrong even if the facts didn't yet support a crisis.
She's not like this, they said.
She would never just leave without calling. The police listened, took the report, and began what they thought would be a standard missing persons investigation. But very quickly, they began to see what the family already knew. This wasn't a woman who simply walked away. Detectives arrived at the apartment and spoke with Mark. He was cooperative, at least on the surface, but emotionally flat. His effect didn't match the situation. No tears. No fear. Just carefully chosen words and vague timelines. He seemed more interested in controlling the narrative than helping to find Michelle. He described her as unstable, implied she might be overwhelmed. He painted himself as the patient ex, stuck with the responsibility of raising their son while she went off to figure things out. But when police probed deeper, asking about Michelle's belongings, her cell phone, her bank activity, the red flags multiplied. Michelle's car was untouched. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her phone, usually active and buzzing, was silent. There was no digital trail, no signs of travel, no messages to friends. It was as if she had evaporated. But people don't just vanish. And Michelle, more than most, would never vanish without leaving a trace. Not unless something terrible had happened. Not unless someone had made sure she couldn't reach out. Police began examining Mark more closely. They studied his body language, his choice of words, and the gaps in his timeline. When asked about his son, he seemed calm. When asked about Michelle, he became guarded. There was no desperation in his voice, no plea for help, just the cool detachment of someone trying to play a role, and not doing it very well. Friends who had seen Michelle in the weeks prior confirmed what the family already suspected. She had been afraid. She felt watched. She had told people Mark was not right, that she feared how he'd react if she tried to leave. One friend said Michelle was making moves, trying to get out quietly. Another said she had even joked that if anything happened to her, look at Mark. No one had thought it would come to this. No one had imagined she'd actually disappear. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began applying pressure. They searched the apartment. They examined digital records. They asked Mark to take a polygraph. And slowly, his calm started to crack. He became evasive. He complained about being harassed. He shifted blame. He played the victim. But behind that facade was a man who was losing control, not just of the narrative, but of himself. For Michelle's family, the weight was unbearable. Every hour without news was torture. Every dead lead felt like a blow. They made flyers. They organized searches. They reached out to the media. They begged for answers. But deep down, many of them already knew the truth, even if they couldn't yet prove it. Michelle hadn't left. She hadn't run away. She hadn't disappeared. She had been taken. And the man who claimed to love her was the one who held the truth. In a small, windowless room in the Houston Police Department, under harsh fluorescent lights and the silent gaze of a wall-mounted camera, Mark Castellano sat, seemingly composed, his hands folded, his face a mask of practiced calm. It had been days since Michelle Warner vanished. Days of deflection, of public silence, of playing the devoted father left behind. But now, seated across from two seasoned detectives, Mark's performance was entering its final act. What followed in the next few hours was not just a confession, it was a masterclass in unraveling the mind of a pathological liar. At first, Mark was controlled, even friendly. He answered questions with a quiet confidence, portraying himself as a cooperative man caught in unfortunate circumstances. He offered small, calculated smiles, trying to charm the detectives, to downplay the severity of the situation. He stuck to his script. Michelle left after an argument. She was unstable, she'd walked out before. He painted her as erratic, unreliable, subtly trying to frame her disappearance as just another episode in a pattern of emotional behavior. But the detectives weren't buying it. They had read his file. They had spoken to Michelle's family. They knew her character, and they knew Mark's type. The interrogators used a method as old as the system itself: patience. They didn't rush to accuse. They let Mark talk. They let him feel in control. Because they knew the more someone like Mark talks, the more cracks begin to show. They observed how he repeated certain phrases, how he avoided specific times in his timeline. They noticed how he downplayed his emotions. A man whose ex-partner and the mother of his child had supposedly disappeared, and yet he showed no worry, no panic, not even frustration. Just rehearsed detachment. Then came the psychological nudges. Subtle, methodical. The detectives began to question small details in his story. Not the big facts, not at first, but the inconsistencies in tone, the gaps in memory, the lack of logical behavior. They questioned why he didn't call Michelle's family. Why he didn't try to find her. Why, if he were so concerned about her well-being, he hadn't posted anything or even searched the area. Each question was delivered gently, but with increasing precision, like tapping at the shell of a brittle egg. Mark shifted in his seat. He smiled less. He began to clarify things he had previously been sure of. His hands moved more. He fidgeted. His voice lost its rhythm. Still, he clung to his narrative. But the detectives were circling. They changed tactics, began to appeal to his ego. They complimented him, told him he was a good dad, told him they understood stress, that relationships are hard, that people lose control, that good people sometimes make bad decisions. Mark looked away. The room became heavier. Minutes passed. Then the detective gently asked, "Did something happen that night?" Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes welled up, not necessarily from guilt, but from the sheer pressure of holding the story together. His shoulders sank. His voice grew quieter. And then, with a tremble in his throat, Mark Castellano said it. Yes. That single word cracked open the dam. What motivated Mark to confess?
Pressure, yes.
But more than that, control. Mark had spent his entire relationship with Michelle trying to control her. He controlled the narrative of their breakup. He controlled her access to freedom. And even after her death, he tried to control the story of her disappearance. But in that room, under those lights, as the detectives closed in, he realized that if he didn't speak, the story would be taken from him completely. So here he wrote it one last time. Not to tell the truth, but to protect what remained of his ego. His confession wasn't a surrender. It was a strategy. A pathological liar cornered by fact, unraveling not from conscience, but from the weight of the lie itself. The confession, when it finally came, did not burst out in a wave of remorse. It wasn't accompanied by tears or desperate pleas for forgiveness. It was clinical, cold. As if Mark Castellano had rehearsed this story in the dark corners of his mind long before he ever sat down in that interrogation room. He spoke not like a man grieving a terrible mistake, but like a man describing the steps of a deeply unpleasant errand, inconvenient, but necessary. And it was in those details, the logistical precision of how he disposed of Michelle Warner's body, that the true horror began to surface. According to Mark, it happened quickly, but his actions afterward told another story. He claimed that during a heated argument, Michelle had confronted him aggressively, and in a moment of panic, he lashed out. He said she hit the floor. No struggle. No fight. Just a sudden collapse. But the detectives had heard this kind of sanitization before, the edited version of murder, crafted by someone who didn't want to sound like a killer. What followed wasn't panic or regret. It was a series of deliberate, meticulous choices. Instead of calling 911, instead of checking for signs of life, instead of even pretending to grieve, Mark left her there, on the bathroom floor of the apartment they once shared. Hours passed. Then he drove back.
Just like that.
No breakdown. No moment of clarity. No attempt at turning himself in. Instead, he returned to Houston, walked into his apartment, and began constructing the lie. The same lie he would maintain in interviews, to Michelle's family, even to his own child. He said Michelle had left. Said she'd stormed out. That she had a history of disappearing. That she was unstable. But the truth, the image of her body wrapped in plastic, tossed into a crude grave while their son slept a few feet away, was festering behind his eyes the entire time. The moment Michelle's body was confirmed, her family collapsed. The hope they had been clinging to, that maybe she'd walked away, that maybe she'd come back, was ripped away. Her mother, who had never gone more than a day without hearing from Michelle, received the news with a primal scream. Her siblings broke down. Friends who had joined the search now held each other in stunned, sobbing silence. Michelle, the bright, fiercely independent woman who had struggled so hard to build a life for herself and her child, was gone. What hurt them most wasn't just the loss. It was the knowledge of what she endured in her final hours, the betrayal, the fear, the brutality. The fact that the man who claimed to love her, who shared a child with her, had not only killed her, but had driven with her body next to their son, buried her like trash, and then returned home to pretend she had abandoned them. And yet, through all the pain and rage, there was a bitter sort of relief. The search was over. The lies had been exposed. The monster had been unmasked. Michelle could finally be laid to rest. And the truth, no matter how ugly, could no longer be hidden beneath Mark Castellano's calculated smile. The final chapter of Michelle Warner's tragic story turns to the courtroom, where the pursuit of justice for her death intersected with the painful, raw emotions of her surviving family members. The trial was a culmination of years of grief, confusion, and heartbreak, as Michelle's family finally saw Mark Castellano face the consequences of his actions. However, the journey toward justice was not straightforward. It was laden with moments of excruciating pain, emotional exhaustion, and a painful realization that, even in a system designed to seek truth, the road to closure can be long and fraught with obstacles. This chapter also takes a step back to reflect on the broader implications of Michelle's death, particularly the issue of domestic violence, coercive control, and emotional abuse. Michelle's story serves as a harrowing case study in how toxic relationships often unfold, how red flags can be ignored or dismissed, and how the emotional manipulation of a partner can lead to devastating consequences. For years, Michelle was trapped in an emotionally abusive relationship that eroded her sense of self-worth and kept her tethered to a man who had no interest in treating her with the respect or love she deserved. The psychological toll of Mark's gaslighting, his controlling behavior, and his ongoing emotional abuse were invisible to many, even to Michelle at times. Her drive to protect her children and her hopes for a better life were ultimately overshadowed by Mark's insidious manipulation. The final moments of this chapter delve into the profound sense of loss that Michelle's family continues to feel. Her parents, her siblings, and especially her children are left to piece together the fragments of their lives without the woman who should have been there to guide them, support them, and love them. Her story serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that we must be vigilant in recognizing the signs of abuse, and we must do more to educate and support those who are trapped in toxic relationships. No one should have to suffer in silence. Michelle's death is a painful loss, but her story, her life, her hopes, and the lessons we can learn from her will endure as a legacy to the strength of the human spirit and the need for greater awareness of the signs of domestic violence. However, by the time the episode aired, Mark had already confessed. Under the pressure of intense police interrogation, Mark finally admitted that he killed Michelle during an argument. He claimed he snapped during a heated exchange in their Houston apartment and strangled her. After the killing, he wrapped her body in a blanket, put it in his car, and drove over 200 miles to Midland, Texas, where he buried her in a shallow grave near his mother's home. In September 2012, based on his confession, police recovered Michelle's body, providing her family with the tragic confirmation they had feared. Mark Castellano was charged with murder. At trial, his defense team attempted to argue that it wasn't premeditated, that he acted in the heat of the moment. But the methodical nature of his actions after the murder, the concealment of the body, the lying to authorities, the national TV appearance, painted a portrait of a cold and calculating man. In 2014, Mark Castellano was convicted of murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole after serving half of that time, though it's unclear whether he will be granted it. Michelle's family was devastated, but relieved to have answers. They continue to raise awareness about emotional abuse, manipulation, and the dangers that can lurk in toxic relationships. Her son, who was just a child at the time of the murder, was left to grow up without his mother and with the painful knowledge that his father was responsible. Michelle Warner's story is a haunting example of how domestic tension, manipulation, and unaddressed psychological instability can culminate in tragedy. But her memory lives on through her family and through awareness efforts that encourage victims of abusive or controlling relationships to speak up and seek help before it's too late.